Jack Miller, 45 years old, was a man who had once thrived in the chaos of battle. As a seasoned veteran of the U.S. military, Jack had participated in countless operations in far-off lands, where each day brought new dangers and life-or-death decisions. He was one of the quiet heroes who dedicated his life to serving his country, facing death and loss time and time again. But after returning from the war, Jack realized that his past triumphs couldn't help him face the ordinary life he now had to navigate. Since leaving the military, Jack had felt lost in a world he had once left behind. The feeling of loneliness had become his constant companion in recent years. The house he had once shared with his wife had now become an empty shell, no longer filled with warmth or shared moments. The tragic death of his wife in a car accident 5 years ago had shattered everything in Jack's life. There was no more laughter, no more late-night talks, no more shared dreams for the future. Everything seemed to fall apart, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Though Jack had 2 grown children, they lived far away and rarely called. The home he had once known as a sanctuary had become a hollow place, just a place where he spent his days alone. The feeling of being forgotten, abandoned by everyone, maybe even by himself, grew heavier each day. Jack was no longer the strong, capable man he once was. He could no longer find comfort in the brief phone calls with old friends or in the few words they shared. Nothing seemed to ease the emptiness that had settled within him. Each morning, Jack woke up to the same haunting silence. There were no more conversations with his wife, no more small gestures of affection, no more future plans to look forward to. He didn't know what was worse, losing her or the loneliness that crept in afterward, filling every corner of his life. Jack had buried his grief deep inside, convinced he could handle it alone. But as time passed, the weight of his sorrow began to take its toll. It became harder to breathe, harder to get through the days. He was no longer the man who could face the world head-on. He was just a shell of the person he once was. Jack had tried to fill the silence with distractions, books, television, even the occasional phone call with old friends. But none of it worked. None of it could fill the void that had grown inside him. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the sound of the wind outside. They all only reminded Jack of his isolation. He felt as though the world outside kept moving while he remained stuck, caught in his past, surrounded by memories and regrets. On one of those dark days, when the loneliness felt the heaviest, Jack received a call from Jim, an old friend from his military days. Jim had always been the lively, optimistic type, someone who could find joy in any situation, something Jack had lost. Jim never let his friends wallow in sadness for too long, and this time was no different. "Jack," Jim's voice came through the phone, light yet firm. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time for you to get a dog. You've got to get out of that house. A little company might do you good." Jack chuckled dryly, but the idea stuck with him. Could a dog really change anything? Could it help ease the pain and the loneliness Jack had carried for so long? It was a thought he'd never entertained, but it began to feel like something worth considering. Jim insisted that Jack visit a local animal shelter. "You've got nothing to lose," Jim said. "Just give it a shot." After some hesitation, Jack agreed. He made plans to visit the shelter, not really expecting much, but realizing he needed to try something, anything, that could break the cycle of isolation. The shelter was quiet, tucked away in a less busy part of town, its narrow paths lined with trees. It was a simple building, nothing particularly remarkable about it, but there was something about the scent of fresh air mixed with the smell of old wood that brought a strange sense of comfort to Jack. He had never been particularly fond of the idea of adopting a pet, but today, something had pushed him to come here. Maybe it was Jim's insistence, or maybe it was just the fact that Jack had nothing else to do, no other purpose but the endless quiet of his home. The first few minutes inside felt almost surreal. The noise of barking filled the air, but the rest of the shelter was calm. Volunteers walked by, tending to the animals in the cages, cleaning, feeding, or just offering a comforting word to the ones who needed it. But despite the noise, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. The dogs, each one unique, were all clearly waiting for someone to take them home. None of them spoke to Jack, though. They all just looked at him with eyes full of longing and uncertainty. That is, until he reached the very last kennel in the corner. There, he saw him. Sarge A., large German shepherd who lay quietly in the back of the cage, his eyes distant and far away. Unlike the other dogs, Sarge didn't rush to the bars or wag his tail in excitement. He just lay there, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Jack felt his heart tighten as he studied the dog. There was something in Sarge's expression that Jack understood all too well. Pain, loss, a silent plea for companionship that was too familiar. It was almost as if the dog was lost in thought, like he was trapped in memories too heavy to bear. He took a step closer, hesitating for a moment. "Hey, buddy," Jack murmured softly. He wasn't sure if the dog could even hear him, but somehow, his voice felt like it was meant to be spoken to this dog, this soul who seemed as broken as he was. The volunteer, a young woman with a warm smile, walked over to Jack's side. "That's Sarge," she said, her tone softening as she watched the dog. "He's been here for a while. He was part of a military canine unit before. After his handler passed away in an ambush, he was retired and ended up here. He's been struggling ever since." Jack felt his stomach knot as she spoke. He knew the bond between a soldier and a dog. It wasn't just a partnership. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be easily broken. A handler's death was a devastating loss for a dog, just as it would have been for the soldiers left behind. Jack wondered if this dog, like him, had been forced to carry on without the person who had meant everything to him. The volunteer continued, "He's a great dog, but he doesn't trust easily. It's going to take time for him to open up." Jack stood in silence for a moment, taking in the information. Something stirred inside him. He had been through his own battles. He had learned to survive on his own, but it didn't mean he had to. Maybe, just maybe, this dog could be the company he needed, the one who could understand his own silent pain. Jack had always been good at helping others, but he'd never really given himself the chance to heal. Perhaps Sarge needed him as much as he needed the dog. "I'll take him," Jack said, with more certainty than he felt. The volunteer looked at him in surprise, then nodded, leading Jack through the paperwork. Jack signed without a second thought. His decision felt almost impulsive, but deep down, he knew it was the right choice. After everything was done, Jack walked to the car with Sarge by his side. The dog was still cautious, but he followed Jack obediently, as if he too had sensed the change. The ride home was silent. Sarge sat in the passenger seat, his head turned toward the window, eyes scanning the world outside with a watchfulness that reminded Jack of his own instincts. Jack couldn't help but smile bitterly. They were both survivors, in their own way. When they arrived at the house, Sarge hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. He sniffed the air as if trying to gauge whether this place was truly safe. Jack opened the door slowly, then knelt down to the dog's level. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, trying to reassure the animal, though he wasn't sure who he was comforting more. "This is home now." The dog took a few cautious steps forward, sniffing the ground, his body still tense. Jack followed him inside, quietly observing as Sarge moved through the house, exploring every corner with a careful, measured pace. He could see the wariness in the dog's movements. It was as if Sarge was preparing for an attack, expecting the worst to happen at any moment. Jack leaned against the wall and watched, realizing that it wasn't just Sarge who needed time to adjust. He, too, had been trying to find his place in the world again, after everything he had lost. The silence in the house, once deafening, now felt like something different. It felt like the start of something new. Maybe, with Sarge here, they could both heal. They both had their scars, their histories, but perhaps together they could find a way to move forward. The first night was difficult. Sarge couldn't seem to settle. He paced the house, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor, his eyes darting around the room, always on alert. Jack lay awake in his bed, listening to the sound of the dog moving through the house. He knew what that felt like, always waiting for something to go wrong. But as the night wore on, something shifted. The pace of Sarge's steps slowed, and eventually there was quiet. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. They were both learning to let go of the past, one step at a time. As the days passed, Jack began to notice small changes in Sarge. The dog's guarded nature had started to soften, though only in brief, subtle moments. At first, Sarge would avoid eye contact, retreating to the corners of the house when Jack would approach. But slowly, those moments of withdrawal began to lessen. Jack could see that Sarge was testing the waters, trying to understand this new, unfamiliar world he had been thrust into. It was like watching a soldier return home, unsure of where he fit, but slowly starting to understand that the war was over, at least for now. It wasn't easy for either of them. Sarge had his own trauma to deal with, a history full of pain and loss. His military training had ingrained in him the need for constant vigilance. He couldn't just sit back and relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound of a car outside, would set him on edge. Jack couldn't blame him. After all, he too had been living on high alert for years. The difference, though, was that Jack didn't have the luxury of working through his trauma. For him, the scars were invisible, buried deep inside. But Sarge's scars were clear. The hesitation, the constant scanning of his surroundings, the way his body tensed at the slightest sound. The first breakthrough came one evening when Jack decided to go for a walk. He didn't expect much. Sarge had barely let him get close, let alone walk beside him. But there was something about the simplicity of the action that felt right. He had grown so used to the solitude of his own thoughts, to the silence in the house. But now there was a chance to do something different, to break free from the patterns that had defined his life for far too long. Jack clipped the leash to Sarge's collar, and the dog stood stiffly, his body coiled like a spring. The walk was slow at first, Sarge unsure of his surroundings, his every step cautious. Jack couldn't help but smile a little at how similar they both were, neither of them really knowing where they were headed, both of them carrying the weight of past losses. But Jack kept walking, one step in front of the other, trying to show Sarge that there was no need to rush, that everything could be taken at a slow, manageable pace. As they walked through the quiet neighborhood, the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The air was cool, the breeze gentle, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt something other than grief and pain. He glanced down at Sarge, noticing how the dog's posture had shifted, how he was no longer rigid but moving more freely. The tension in his muscles had eased just slightly, and Jack could see it. A glimpse of the dog starting to trust, starting to feel safe. After a while, they reached the park, a peaceful little spot with benches lining the walking path. Jack sat down on one of the benches, letting out a long breath. Sarge walked around for a moment, sniffing the grass, his tail low but steady. It was a sign of progress, small but meaningful. For a while, neither of them said anything. Jack watched as Sarge walked closer, his body still tense but with a new sense of curiosity. Eventually, the dog sat next to him, just a few feet away, watching the world go by. It was the first real moment of connection they had, and Jack could feel the weight of it. Something had shifted, something had clicked. They weren't exactly friends yet, but they were starting to become something close. The days that followed continued in the same vein, small steps forward, a gradual trust building between them. Jack would often find Sarge sitting near him, his body language no longer as defensive. Sometimes, when Jack sat in his chair, Sarge would lie down nearby, his head resting on the floor, eyes still alert, but not as anxious as before. There were moments when the dog would approach Jack and nuzzle his hand, asking for attention in a way that felt tentative but genuine. Jack, for his part, kept doing what he had always done best, offering reassurance, offering patience. But the biggest challenge came one rainy afternoon. Jack had just returned home after running errands, and as he walked through the door, he found Sarge standing at the window, staring out at the rain. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed. Jack set down the bags he was carrying and walked over to the dog. "It's just rain, buddy," Jack murmured, kneeling down beside Sarge. "Nothing to worry about." But Sarge didn't seem to hear him. The dog's body was taut with tension, his eyes watching every droplet that fell from the sky. Jack understood that look. He had seen it too many times in the eyes of soldiers returning from battle, always alert, always waiting for something to happen. He reached out slowly, placing a hand gently on the dog's side. "Hey," he said softly, trying to ground Sarge in the present moment. "It's okay. You're safe here. We're safe." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Sarge turned his head to look at Jack. The dog's eyes met his, and there was a shift, a spark of recognition. In that moment, Jack saw it. He wasn't sure if it was because of the calm in his voice or the steady presence of his hand on Sarge's side, but the dog finally relaxed. He lowered his head, his muscles loosening, and Jack could feel the tension melt away. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't instant, but it was progress. It was moments like this that made Jack realize just how much he had underestimated the power of simple trust. He had expected the process of healing to be slow and painful, and in many ways, it was. But there were also those fleeting moments, those rare moments of connection where everything seemed to click into place. With Sarge, Jack was starting to let go of his own defenses, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they both had a chance at healing. And so, day by day, they continued to build their bond. There were setbacks, of course. There were days when Sarge would withdraw, when the old habits of vigilance would take over. But there were more days where the dog would follow Jack from room to room or curl up beside him on the couch, a quiet, steadfast companion. One afternoon, after a particularly long walk, Jack sat on the porch watching the sun set. Sarge lay at his feet, his head resting on Jack's shoes. Jack felt a warmth in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer living in the shadow of his past. With Sarge by his side, Jack could finally breathe a little easier. He wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone. "You're not just a dog, you know," Jack said quietly, looking down at Sarge. "You're a good friend." And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack realized that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to heal too. The healing process, Jack learned, wasn't linear. It wasn't a smooth path with clear markers of progress. Rather, it was a messy journey filled with small victories, moments of doubt, and the occasional setback. But one thing was clear. Every step forward, no matter how small, was a sign that they were moving in the right direction. Sarge had begun to trust Jack more each day. He was no longer constantly on edge, jumping at every sound or movement. The dog's eyes, once filled with wariness, were now softening, and Jack couldn't help but notice how Sarge's posture had become more relaxed. There were still moments of hesitation, still times when the dog would freeze or look around nervously, but they were fewer and farther between. Jack understood that this was part of the process. Trust couldn't be rushed. It had to be earned, and it had to be nurtured. It was a Saturday afternoon when Jack realized just how far they had come. He had taken Sarge for a long walk through the park. The weather was perfect, crisp air, clear skies, and the kind of sunshine that made everything feel alive. Jack had always enjoyed walking, but today, there was something different. As they walked side by side, Jack could feel the rhythm of their steps syncing up, an unspoken understanding growing between them. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. It was as if they were both learning to coexist, sharing this quiet moment of peace. Sarge was walking with a newfound ease, his head held higher than it had been before. He no longer felt the need to scan the environment every few seconds. Instead, he trotted along, tail swaying lightly, as if he had finally come to terms with the fact that he was safe. For Jack, it was a powerful moment. He had never expected the dog to heal so quickly. After all, Jack himself had spent years burying his own pain, not allowing himself the space to heal. But here, in the presence of this dog, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Jack couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed since Sarge had entered it. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum of his past. It had become a place of quiet comfort, a sanctuary where he could start fresh. Sarge had brought something into his life that he had lost years ago: a sense of companionship, a connection that didn't demand anything but trust. Jack had always been self-sufficient, but he realized now that he had been holding on to his pain for far too long, not allowing anyone or anything to help him through it. Sarge had broken down those walls, brick by brick, showing Jack that it was okay to lean on someone, even a dog. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. Jack found himself taking Sarge everywhere with him, on walks, to the store, even just to sit on the porch in the evenings. The dog was becoming more than just a companion. He was a friend, a partner in the quiet battle of healing. When Jack would sit in his favorite chair by the window, Sarge would lie next to him, his head resting on the floor, eyes closed in contentment. There was a peace in those moments that Jack had longed for but never quite found. He didn't need to fill the silence with words. Just the presence of Sarge beside him was enough. One morning, as Jack sipped his coffee on the porch, he noticed something different. Sarge, who had always kept a safe distance from the front gate, was now standing just a few feet away from it, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Jack raised an eyebrow, wondering what had caught the dog's attention. For a brief moment, he thought the dog might bolt, might retreat to his old ways of hiding. But then, to Jack's surprise, Sarge simply stood there, calm and collected, his tail wagging gently. It was as if Sarge had finally accepted that the world outside wasn't a threat anymore, that he was in control of his own destiny now. Jack set his coffee mug down and walked over to Sarge, kneeling down beside him. "You okay, buddy?" he asked softly. Sarge turned his head to look at Jack, his amber eyes meeting his with an expression of quiet understanding. Jack reached out and scratched behind the dog's ear, feeling the familiar warmth of their connection. "You've come a long way," Jack murmured, his voice low with emotion. Sarge nuzzled his hand gently, and in that moment, Jack knew they were no longer two strangers sharing a space. They were a team, bound together by their mutual need for healing. Later that day, Jack took Sarge to the local dog park. It had always been a place he avoided, not because of the dogs, but because of the people. He had always been uncomfortable in crowds, preferring solitude to interaction. But now, with Sarge by his side, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't known he was missing. They arrived at the park, and Jack noticed that Sarge was more relaxed than usual. He trotted confidently ahead, tail wagging, his eyes scanning the park not with fear, but with curiosity. It was clear that the dog had come a long way. The nervous, hyper-alert creature Jack had brought home weeks ago had transformed into a confident, self-assured companion. At first, Sarge stayed close to Jack, but soon enough he began to interact with the other dogs. He sniffed around, wagging his tail and exchanging greetings with the other dogs in the park. Jack smiled as he watched the dog. This was something he never thought he would see. Sarge, once so distrustful of everyone and everything, was now allowing himself to be part of something greater than his own fear. The breakthrough came when Sarge ran toward a group of dogs playing fetch. One of the dogs, a young Labrador, dropped the ball right at Sarge's feet, looking up at him with playful eyes. For a moment, Sarge froze. Then, as if something inside him clicked, he picked up the ball and trotted back to Jack, tail wagging. Jack laughed, genuinely amused. "Well, look at you," he said, giving Sarge a playful rub on the head. "You're a natural." As the sun began to set, Jack and Sarge left the park, walking side by side. Jack felt a deep sense of pride, not just in the dog, but in himself. They had both come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Jack knew they could face them together. There was a quiet strength in their bond, a bond that had been forged through mutual understanding and unspoken trust. Back at home, Jack sat on the porch once more with Sarge resting at his feet. The quiet was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful, comforting. Jack had learned to embrace the silence, to find solace in the presence of his dog. He wasn't just healing because of Sarge, he was healing with Sarge. They were both walking a path toward a brighter future, one step at a time. As Jack looked down at Sarge, who had now made himself comfortable by his side, he smiled. "We're getting there, huh, buddy?" he whispered. Sarge looked up at him, eyes full of trust, and gave a soft whine of agreement. Jack chuckled softly. "Yeah, me too." They had found their way back to each other, and together, they were moving forward. And that, Jack realized, was enough. It was more than enough. The first signs of spring arrived quietly in the small town, as the chill of winter began to fade, leaving behind the promise of new beginnings. Jack and Sarge were standing at the edge of the park one afternoon, watching as the trees began to bud, and the grass turned from brown to green. It was a sight Jack had seen countless times before, but this time it felt different. This time it wasn't just the seasons changing, it was his life, and Sarge's, slowly shifting as well. The dog, once a shell of a soldier, now moved with a quiet confidence. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Jack had never believed in the magic of time. He had always been someone who believed in taking control, in finding strength in oneself. But with Sarge, Jack had learned the truth. Sometimes healing comes not from within, but from the connection we make with others. It was through Sarge's trust that Jack had begun to reclaim his own sense of hope. Over the past few months, Jack had witnessed how small moments, those fleeting seconds when Sarge would look up at him or when the dog would relax and rest his head in Jack's lap, had begun to change the nature of their relationship. They had gone from strangers, each carrying their own burdens, to something more, companions, allies in the quiet war of healing. Sarge had not only earned Jack's trust, but had also in turn helped Jack rediscover his own humanity, his own capacity for kindness, for patience. One morning, Jack woke up early, as he often did, and went downstairs to make his coffee. Sarge, who had been sleeping peacefully at the foot of Jack's bed, was already there, sitting by the kitchen door, waiting. Jack couldn't help but smile as he bent down to pet the dog's head. It was a small gesture, but one that had become a ritual. There was no longer any fear in Sarge's eyes, no more constant scanning of the surroundings. The dog now waited for Jack's cue, no longer anticipating danger at every turn. And for the first time in years, Jack found himself starting to live without looking over his shoulder as well. The bond between them had grown stronger, not just in the way they interacted, but in the way they cared for each other. Jack had made a habit of walking Sarge through the town each morning, and these walks had become a grounding routine. They weren't just about exercise, they were about reclaiming a part of their lives that had been lost. Jack had begun to find peace in the simplicity of the routine, the quiet mornings, the steady pace, the soft sound of Sarge's paws on the ground beside him. One of the changes Jack had noticed was how Sarge had started to engage with the world around him. At first, the dog had kept to himself, wary of people and other dogs. But as the weeks passed, Sarge had started to interact more. He would wag his tail at passing pedestrians, and on their walks through the park, he would stop to sniff at the flowers or watch children play without the same look of distrust he once carried. It was as if Sarge was finally allowing himself to enjoy life again, rather than merely surviving it. One afternoon, as they walked along the park's path, Jack noticed something that made his heart swell. Sarge, who had always kept a careful distance from other dogs, was now playing with a golden retriever. The two dogs were running together, chasing after a ball, their movements carefree and joyful. Jack stood there for a moment watching the scene, feeling a rush of pride. The dog who had once been broken was now a part of the world again, participating, living in the present. It wasn't just Sarge who had healed. Jack had healed too, in ways he hadn't even realized were possible. They had come so far together, from the first uncertain steps of their relationship to this moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Jack was reminded of the first time he had taken Sarge to the park when the dog had been so wary, so distant, and now here they were, both of them running, living, finding joy in the simplest of things. Later that day, as they sat on a park bench, Sarge curled up at Jack's feet, Jack reflected on the journey they had shared. It hadn't been an easy road, but it had been worth it. They had fought their own battles, each one of them struggling with their pasts, with their own wounds. But together, they had learned to trust again. They had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain, it was about accepting it, living with it, and moving forward side by side. That evening, after returning home, Jack sat in his favorite chair, Sarge lying at his feet as usual. The house was quieter now, no longer filled with the deafening silence that had haunted Jack for so long. The quiet had become a friend, a comfortable presence. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't feel the weight of his grief, his regrets. He felt lighter, as if the weight of his past had been lifted, piece by the companionship of this remarkable dog. Jack reached down and scratched behind Sarge's ear. The dog looked up at him, eyes full of trust and understanding, and Jack knew that they were no longer just two broken souls trying to survive. They were a team, a partnership that had been forged through time, patience, and unconditional love. Jack had found in Sarge the one thing he had been searching for all along, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. Looking out the window, Jack saw the first stars of the evening beginning to appear. The night was peaceful, the air still and quiet. He thought about the future, about the path that lay ahead. He didn't know exactly what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't alone. "You and me? We've got this, huh?" Jack whispered to Sarge, his voice filled with quiet confidence. Sarge, as if in response, rested his head on Jack's knee, his eyes closing in contentment. The two of them sat there in the stillness, finding comfort in each other's presence. Jack didn't need words to know that they had both come to the same understanding. They were no longer just surviving, they were living, and together they would continue to heal, step by step, with each new day bringing the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the seasons continued to change, Jack began to realize that healing wasn't just about time. It was about embracing the journey, the moments of growth, and the small victories along the way. Life, with all its twists and turns, had a way of teaching us lessons when we least expected them, and Jack had learned one of the most profound truths: the power of companionship, the ability to heal when we open our hearts to others. It was a cool morning when Jack sat on the porch, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Sarge, as always, was by his side, lying in the sunlight streaming through the trees, watching the world pass by. The house, which had once felt like a tomb of memories and regrets, now felt like home. Jack had built this new life not alone, but with the silent support of the dog who had become his anchor. There were days when Jack would reflect on the person he had been before Sarge came into his life. The man who had been trapped in his grief, unable to move forward. He thought of the years he spent buried in memories of the past, locked away in a self-imposed prison of isolation. But now, sitting here with Sarge at his feet, Jack knew he had found a way out. Healing was not an instant fix, and it wasn't something that could be rushed. It took time, it took patience, and most of all, it took the willingness to open up and let someone, something else in. The bond that had formed between Jack and Sarge was one of mutual understanding. Neither of them had asked for their pasts. Neither of them had chosen to carry the burdens they had. But together they had found a way to share that burden, to carry it together. Jack had learned to trust again, not just in others, but in himself. And Sarge had learned that not all humans were to be feared. Some, like Jack, could be trusted. Some were worth believing in. There were still challenges ahead. Jack knew that. There would be days when the shadows of their pasts would loom over them, threatening to pull them back into the darkness. There would be times when Sarge would have a setback, when the old habits of war and fear would return. But now, Jack understood something he hadn't before. Healing wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about reaching a final destination and leaving everything behind. Healing was about progress, about moving forward despite the setbacks, about finding the strength to keep going even when the road ahead seemed impossible. That morning, as Jack sat there with Sarge, he thought about the future. He thought about what he wanted for the days to come. He no longer felt the need to plan for a life filled with regret or fear. He no longer sought to avoid pain at all costs. Instead, Jack had learned to embrace the pain, to accept it as part of who he was. It was through the pain that he had grown stronger. It was through the challenges that he had become someone capable of truly living again. Sarge looked up at Jack then, his amber eyes filled with a quiet understanding. It was as if the dog, too, had learned the same lesson. They had both fought battles, both been broken by the weight of their pasts, but together, they had found a way to move forward. Together, they had created a new life, one built on trust, patience, and unconditional love. As they walked through the park later that day, the sun setting behind them, Jack felt a peace he had never known before. The world seemed different now, brighter, fuller, more alive. He and Sarge walked side by side, each step a reminder of the journey they had taken, of how far they had come. The future, once so uncertain and frightening, now felt full of possibility. The lesson that Jack had learned was simple but powerful. No matter how broken we may feel, no matter how far we've fallen, there is always a way back. Healing doesn't come from forgetting the past or erasing the pain. It comes from learning to live with it, to accept it as part of who we are, and to find the courage to move forward anyway. It comes from opening ourselves to others, to companionship, to love. Jack had found that healing in Sarge, and Sarge had found it in him. As they reached the end of their walk, Jack stopped for a moment to look around. The park, the trees, the distant sounds of children playing, all of it felt different. It felt like life was beginning again, not in some distant future, but right here, in the present. He wasn't looking back anymore. He wasn't trapped by his past. He was living. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Jack looked down at Sarge, who was wagging his tail, his head held high, a proud, contented look in his eyes. "We made it, buddy," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sarge gave a soft bark in response, as if agreeing, as if understanding that they had both found their way. Together, they had learned that the key to healing was not in the destination, but in the journey. It was in the moments of quiet companionship, in the small victories, in the trust that had been built over time. Jack had come to understand that life wasn't about escaping the pain. It was about living alongside it, moving forward with it, and allowing it to shape you into something stronger, something better. And as they walked back home, side by side, Jack knew that no matter what came next, he and Sarge would face it together. They had both come so far, and they would continue to walk this road, not alone, but with each other, until the very end. The story of Jack and Sarge teaches us about the healing power of companionship, trust, and shared struggle. Both Jack, burdened by his past, and Sarge, a dog scarred by war, were broken when they met. Through their growing bond and trust, they learned that healing is not a solitary journey. It involves vulnerability, accepting help, and learning to live with pain instead of being controlled by it. Sarge, once fearful and mistrustful, finds peace and joy again, while Jack opens his heart and lets go of his past. Their story shows that true healing comes from embracing imperfections, forming bonds, and finding strength in each other. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we can find hope and growth through empathy and love. With support and trust, healing is always possible, even if the journey is long. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.